Employees laughed at the homeless woman in the jewelry store. But minutes later they were shocked. Margaret Johnson pressed the small wooden box against her chest as she watched hurried pedestrians pass her on the sidewalk. She had rehearsed that moment for weeks, but now that she was there in front of the gleaming entrance, fear paralyzed her. Her fingers trembled, not from the chill of the New York morning, but from the certainty that crossing that door meant facing a past she had tried to bury for decades. When she finally gathered courage and pushed the glass door, the disdainful look from the two employees behind the counter was immediate. The young man, in an impeccable suit and navy blue tie, nudged his colleague beside him and discreetly pointed at Margaret's worn-out clothes. The woman, also dressed formally, let out a muffled chuckle and whispered something Margaret couldn't hear. But she perfectly imagined the content. She knew that kind of look, that kind of silent judgment people made based solely on appearance. But this time Margaret couldn't back down, not when she was so close. The store was small but elegant, with illuminated display cases showing gold necklaces, diamond rings and silver bracelets. The white marble floor reflected the ceiling lights, creating an almost celestial atmosphere. Margaret walked slowly, her worn-out sneakers making a slight squeak with each step, contrasting with the refined silence of the establishment. She knew she didn't belong there, at least not with that appearance. But appearances can be deceiving, and she was about to prove it. The manager, a man of about 30 years named Ryan Cooper, watched the woman with a mix of curiosity and irritation. He had started working at that luxury jewelry store in the Fifth Avenue Mall just 6 months ago, and had already learned to identify who the real customers were and who were just curious people coming in to escape the heat or use the restroom. That woman definitely seemed to belong to the second group. Beside him, Jessica Parker, the saleswoman who had worked there for 3 years, had seen similar situations before. People without financial means who entered luxury stores just to dream, or worse, to attempt some kind of scam. She maintained a professional smile on her face, but her eyes said something else. Margaret noticed every nuance of that look, every unspoken judgment. The woman stopped in front of a specific display case, the one showing pearl necklaces. Her eyes, though tired and marked by time, shone with an intensity that Jessica noticed but didn't understand. Margaret leaned slightly, examining each piece with an attention that seemed disproportionate for someone in her condition. Her hands, though dirty and calloused, moved delicately as she pointed to one of the pieces through the glass. Ryan and Jessica exchanged another look. This was starting to bother them. The store was empty at that morning hour, and the presence of that woman made the atmosphere uncomfortable. Ryan thought about calling her and politely asking her to leave, but something stopped him. Perhaps it was the possibility of a complaint, or perhaps it was the way she looked at those pearls, as if she were seeing a ghost from the past. Margaret finally approached the counter. Jessica straightened her posture, preparing for what was to come. The woman with graying hair, which seemed not to have seen a comb in days, placed the small wooden box on the glass counter. Ryan immediately stepped back a little, as if that object might be contaminated. The lady wanted to see the pearl necklace from the display case, which cost almost $15,000. Jessica held back a laugh but maintained the professional composure the job required. She said she would need to check if the piece was available, although everyone there knew it was. It was a common tactic to discourage unwanted customers without having to be too direct in the refusal. Margaret didn't seem to mind the delay. She simply stood there, motionless, holding her small wooden box, her eyes fixed on the display window. Ryan, impatient, began tapping his fingers on the counter, a nervous habit he had when irritated. Jessica returned after a few minutes, saying that unfortunately that specific model was out of stock, but she could show other options. That's when Margaret opened the wooden box. Inside, wrapped in faded red velvet cloth, was a single pearl. But it wasn't an ordinary pearl. Even under the jewelry store's artificial lighting, it emitted a deep, dark, almost hypnotic glow. It was black, with reflections ranging from green to blue and purple, depending on the angle of the light. Margaret carefully picked up the pearl, as if holding a fragile treasure, and placed it on the counter. She explained in a calm but firm voice that she would like to compare that pearl with the ones in the necklace Jessica had said was out of stock. She wanted to know if they were of the same type, the same quality. Ryan let out a short, dry laugh. He leaned over the counter and said, in a tone that didn't hide his disdain, that they didn't appraise junk brought in from the street. This was a serious jewelry store, not a thrift shop or pawn shop. Margaret didn't react to the provocation. Her eyes remained fixed on the pearl, and she simply repeated her request, this time more firmly. Jessica, who had observed the pearl more closely, felt something strange. There was something about that piece that didn't seem ordinary. The size, the shine, the perfection of the spherical shape. She had worked with jewelry long enough to know it wasn't a cheap imitation. Discreetly, without Ryan noticing, she signaled to the store's appraiser, a man in his late 50s named William Harrison, who was in the back office. William was a man of few words but vast knowledge. He had spent over 40 years working with precious stones and had seen pieces that most people only knew from photos. When Jessica showed him the pearl, he picked up his jeweler's loupe and examined the piece under the light. His face, always serious and impassive, visibly paled. Ryan noticed the change in atmosphere. William never showed strong emotions, but now he was clearly shaken. The appraiser looked at Margaret, then at the pearl, then back at Margaret. He asked in a controlled but tense voice where she had obtained that piece. Margaret replied that it was a family heirloom. William nodded slowly, placing the pearl back on the counter with extreme care. He called Ryan aside and whispered something in his ear. The manager, who moments before was ready to kick the woman out of the store, widened his eyes in shock. That was a Tahitian black pearl, one of the rarest in the world. Based on its size and quality, William estimated it was easily worth between $50,000 and $80,000 alone. A single pearl. Ryan felt the blood drain from his face. Jessica, who had overheard part of the conversation, covered her mouth with her hands, horrified by what they had done. They had mocked, laughed, and practically tried to throw out a woman carrying a fortune in an old wooden box. The manager immediately changed his demeanor. In a soft and respectful voice, he apologized for the misunderstanding and offered a chair for Margaret to sit. Jessica rushed to get a glass of water, her hands trembling as she poured it. Ryan asked if she would like coffee, perhaps tea, anything to make up for the inappropriate treatment. Margaret declined everything with a wave of her hand. She hadn't come there to be treated like a VIP after proving her worth. She had a specific goal, and the change in the employee's attitude didn't alter that. Calmly, she pulled from the inner pocket of her worn-out jacket an old photograph, faded by time. The photo showed an elegant woman, about 40 years old, wearing a 1960s evening gown. Around her neck was a complete set of black pearls, a majestic necklace that reached down to the middle of her chest, with the same pearl now on the counter, being just one of the many that made up the piece. Margaret explained that was her mother, Katherine Johnson, photographed in 1967 during a party in New York City. The set of pearls had been a family heirloom, passed down from generation to generation. But decades ago, for reasons she preferred not to detail at that moment, the necklace had been sold. Margaret had kept only one pearl, the only one she managed to hide before the sale. Now, after all these years, she finally had the means to search for the necklace. Not necessarily to buy it back, but to find out where it was, who had it, if it still existed intact. It was a matter of closing a cycle, of making peace with the past. Ryan listened to the story with growing attention. Jessica, still embarrassed, picked up the photograph and examined it carefully. William, the appraiser, excused himself and went to the store's archives. Luxury jewelry stores kept detailed records of all the pieces that passed through there, especially the rare ones. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. While William searched the archives, Margaret remained standing, refusing to sit down. She watched every movement of the employees, every exchanged glance between them. Ryan tried to make conversation, asking about her mother, about the family history, but Margaret answered in monosyllables, offering no more information than strictly necessary. Jessica, still processing the embarrassment of having mocked a customer who carried a fortune, tried to remedy the situation in another way. She began showing other pearl necklaces they had in the store, beautiful pieces that paled in comparison to what was in the old photograph. Margaret looked politely, but her interest was clearly elsewhere. William returned after 20 minutes, carrying an old file folder. His eyes were different now. There was something that seemed like recognition, perhaps even a touch of reverence. He opened the folder on the counter and began flipping through documents yellowed with age. What he found made everyone in the room hold their breath. There was a purchase record for a black pearl necklace from Tahiti, dated 1982. The necklace had been acquired by that jewelry store, which at the time had a different name and owner, but occupied the same space in the mall. And the seller of the necklace, according to the document, was Catherine Johnson. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, as if that confirmation brought both relief and pain. It was right there. The necklace had passed through that store in that exact place where she was now 43 years later. Ryan asked what had happened to the piece after the purchase. William continued flipping through the papers, looking for transfers or subsequent sales. He found something but hesitated before speaking. The necklace had not been resold to another customer. It had been transferred to the private collection of the jewelry chain's owner. Margaret felt her heart race. The owner of the chain. The owner of... She didn't know who that was, had never researched it, but now she needed to know. Jessica, sensing the urgency in the woman's expression, asked if Margaret would like them to contact the owner. The answer was a firm and immediate yes. Ryan picked up the phone and dialed the private number of the chain's owner, Eleanor Richmond, a 65-year-old businesswoman who had transformed the small jewelry store inherited from her father into a chain of luxury shops spread across New York City. The call was brief. Ryan explained the situation, mentioned the black pearl, the old photograph, the customer's story. On the other end of the line, there was a long silence, followed by a response that surprised the manager. Eleanor Richmond would come to the store in person. She would be there in less than an hour. While they waited, Margaret finally agreed to sit down. Not because she was physically tired, but because her legs were trembling with anticipation of what was to come. Jessica brought the glass of water that had been refused earlier, and this time Margaret accepted, drinking it in small sips. Ryan, trying to break the tense silence, asked where Margaret currently lived. The answer that came was unexpected and disturbing. She said she had no fixed address, that she spent her nights in shelters or, when there were no vacancies, on the streets themselves. She slept under awnings, in subway stations, on park benches. The information fell like a bomb in the room. Jessica's eyes widened, looking at the valuable pearl on the counter, and then at the woman who owned it. How could someone who had a fortune in their hands be living on the streets? It made no sense. Margaret, noticing the confusion on the employees' faces, offered an explanation. She said the life she led was a choice, not an imposition of circumstances. She had lost her daughter many years ago, under circumstances that still hurt too much to speak about aloud. After that event, nothing made sense anymore. The apartment where she lived seemed too empty. The walls echoed with memories she couldn't bear to face. So she sold everything. Every piece of furniture, every appliance, every object that connected her to that previous life. She donated the money to institutions that help children, a way of giving other young girls the opportunities her daughter no longer had a chance to have. She kept only the clothes on her back, some essential documents, and her mother's pearl. That single pearl was her last link to her family, to a time when there was still hope. William, who was the same age as Margaret, understood in a way the younger ones couldn't. He had seen a lot in life, had met people who reacted to grief in ways that were incomprehensible to others. Everyone dealt with pain in their own way, and who was he to judge? Jessica felt tears sting her eyes. She had laughed at that woman, made jokes about her clothes, her hair, her appearance. It had never crossed her mind that behind that facade of poverty was a story of such profound loss, of such real pain. Ryan fell silent, processing the information. He thought about his own life, how he worried about trivial things, about sales, about goals, about commissions. And here was a woman who had lost everything that really mattered and still found the strength to go on, even if it was just existing, breathing, moving forward. Time passed slowly as they waited. Margaret closed her eyes several times, seeming to fight memories that insisted on invading her mind. Jessica and Ryan didn't dare ask any more questions, respecting the woman's silence. When Eleanor Richmond finally arrived, the atmosphere in the store changed completely. She was an imposing woman with hair perfectly styled in an elegant bun, wearing an expensive tailored suit and high-heeled shoes that clicked against the marble floor. Her eyes, however, were kind, and in them was a wisdom that only comes with decades of life experience. She entered the store, and her eyes immediately found Margaret. There was a moment of recognition, a second frozen in time where something passed between the two women. Eleanor stopped mid-stride, her expression shifting from professional curiosity to absolute shock. Margaret rose slowly from the chair, her eyes fixed on the businesswoman. The two women stared at each other for long seconds, while Ryan, Jessica, and William watched without understanding what was happening. It was Eleanor who broke the silence. Her voice came out trembling, filled with emotion. "Professor Margaret, is it really you?" Margaret nodded slightly, her eyes welling up. The businesswoman crossed the distance between them in quick steps, and to everyone's surprise, hugged the humble-looking woman with strength and genuine affection. Jessica and Ryan exchanged glances, completely lost. William, more observant, began putting together the puzzle pieces. When they finally separated, Eleanor held Margaret's hands in hers, not minding the dirt or their worn appearance. She had tears streaming freely down her face, smudging her carefully applied makeup. The businesswoman then turned to the employees and made a revelation that left everyone frozen. Margaret wasn't just any woman with a rare pearl. She was Margaret Johnson, one of the most talented concert pianists the United States had ever produced. In the 70s and 80s, she had performed on the country's greatest stages, had been celebrated, admired, revered. But more than that, Margaret had been Eleanor's piano teacher. For years, when Eleanor was just a poor teenager dreaming of playing professionally, but had no money to pay for lessons, Margaret had taught her for free. More than that, she had secretly paid her conservatory tuition, provided sheet music, arranged performances, opened doors. Everything Eleanor had achieved, all the fortune that allowed her to transform a jewelry store into a successful chain, had started with music. She played piano at luxury events, elite weddings, business parties. It was at one of these events that she met the man who would become her husband, and who later left her his father's jewelry store as inheritance. And all of this was only possible because Margaret Johnson, the teacher who now stood there dressed in rags, had believed in a poor girl decades ago. Ryan felt his stomach churn with shame. Jessica covered her face with her hands, tears finally flowing. William looked at Margaret with new respect, understanding he was in the presence of someone truly extraordinary. Eleanor wanted to know what had happened, how Margaret had ended up in that situation. The pianist told, in a tired voice, the same story she had told the employees. The loss of her daughter, the subsequent emptiness, the decision to get rid of everything. But there was more. Margaret revealed she hadn't played piano since her daughter's departure. It was as if the music had been buried along with the young woman. Her hands, which once created melodies that made audiences cry, were now hardened by time on the streets, by the occasional jobs she did to get food. Eleanor was visibly shaken. She begged Margaret to let her help, offered an apartment, money, anything. But the teacher gently refused. She hadn't gone there seeking charity. She had gone looking for her mother's necklace. The businesswoman nodded, understanding. She asked Ryan to close the store for a few hours, to lock the door. That conversation needed privacy. The manager immediately obeyed, turning the sign on the door and lowering the display window curtains. Eleanor then went to a cabinet in the back of the store, a special safe where she kept her most precious pieces. She entered the code, opened the reinforced metal door and took out a black velvet box. Opening it, she revealed the black Tahitian pearl necklace, exactly as it appeared in the old photograph. Margaret Johnson gasped upon seeing the complete piece after so many decades. Her hands trembled as they reached out to touch the necklace, but she stopped halfway as if she didn't have permission. Eleanor Richmond placed the box in Margaret's hands, closing her fingers over the velvet. "It was hers by right," the businesswoman said. "It always had been." But Margaret shook her head. She didn't want the necklace back. She couldn't just take it, not after it had been legally sold decades ago. What she wanted was to propose something different. The pianist suggested they use the necklace and its individual pearl. to create something that would make a difference. They could establish a program where forgotten jewelry, pieces people no longer wore or that had painful stories, would be donated and converted into scholarships for young talents. Music, art, any form of expression that needed financial support. Eleanor fell silent, processing the proposal. Then a slow smile formed on her face. It was perfect. It was exactly the kind of thing Professor Margaret would do. The businesswoman agreed immediately. More than that, she offered the structure of her stores as collection points. She could create a foundation, handle all the legal and administrative parts. The pearl necklace would be the centerpiece, the symbol of the program. Jessica Parker, who had remained quiet throughout the conversation, spoke for the first time. She apologized, with a choked voice, for having treated her so badly. Ryan Cooper did the same, his words stumbling with genuine shame. Margaret looked at the two young people, and something softened in her expression. She said she held no grudges, that she understood. Judgment based on appearances was something society taught people to do. The important thing was to learn from mistakes. William Harrison, who had observed everything in silence, excused himself and went to his office. He returned minutes later with a different folder, older than the first one. Inside were documents he had never shown anyone before. The appraiser revealed that 20 years ago, his younger sister had received an anonymous scholarship to study at the conservatory. The family never knew who the benefactor was, only that someone had paid the girl's tuition for 4 years. His sister was now a music teacher at a public school, teaching underprivileged children. He'd always wondered who could have done that. Now, looking at Margaret, he knew the answer. William took from his pocket the faded photo of his sister on graduation day and showed it to the pianist. Margaret smiled upon seeing the image, one of the first times she had smiled in years. She admitted that yes, she had helped many young people over the years. Even after she stopped playing, she still had contacts, she still knew influential people. A word here, a recommendation there, and lives were transformed. Jessica noticed something then. She excused herself and ran to the office, returning with the store's customer records. She started searching, flipping through page after page of transactions. Then she found it. Over the years, there had been occasional sales of rare jewelry, always made by a certain M. Johnson, always with the money being transferred immediately to third-party accounts. There were dozens of transactions, perhaps hundreds. Margaret had sold piece after piece of her family inheritance, using the money to help people who would never know her name. Ryan did the math mentally. The total value of the jewelry sold over the decades was astronomical, millions of dollars easily. And Margaret had given it all, absolutely everything, keeping only the final pearl. Eleanor was openly crying now. She had always wondered who had paid her tuition at the conservatory, who had believed in her when no one else did. Now she knew, and the gratitude she felt was so overwhelming she could barely breathe. The businesswoman made a decision at that moment. She would not only create the scholarship program that Margaret had suggested, but also make it mandatory in all her stores that every person who entered be treated with the same respect, regardless of appearance. There would be training, clear policies, consequences for anyone who discriminated against customers. More than that, she offered Margaret a job. Not an ordinary job, but the position of coordinator for the scholarship program. Margaret could use her experience, her contacts, her knowledge to identify and help young talents. The pianist hesitated. She wasn't sure if she was ready to return to the world of music, even if indirectly. But Eleanor insisted, saying it didn't need to be an immediate decision. Margaret could think. She could take as much time as she needed. Meanwhile, William had more revelations to make. He had researched the origin of the pearl necklace in his personal archives, and what he found was extraordinary. That set wasn't just rare for being made of black pearls from Tahiti. There was a much deeper story behind it. According to old records he had found in his personal research on rare jewels, that set had belonged to the English royal family during the 19th century. When the royal family fled to the United States in 1808, they brought with them not only personal belongings, but treasures of incalculable value. One of the jewels brought was exactly that set of black pearls, which had been a gift from a Polynesian sultan to the English court. Decades later, When the royal family returned to England, some pieces were left behind, given as gifts to people who had served the court with loyalty. Margaret confirmed the story with a nod. She said her great-grandmother had been a lady-in-waiting to the last princess of the imperial family of the United States. As a reward for decades of dedicated service, the princess had given the pearl set to her great-grandmother on the noble lady's deathbed. The jewel had been passed from mother to daughter ever since, always to the firstborn of the family. Margaret's great-grandmother passed it to her grandmother, who passed it to Catherine, Margaret's mother, who should have passed it to Margaret's daughter. But the young woman had departed before that was possible. Jessica had more questions, but didn't dare ask them. She realized some topics were too delicate, too painful to be explored at that moment. It was Ryan who asked in a soft voice why Margaret had kept only one pearl when she sold the necklace. The answer came filled with emotion. Margaret explained that her daughter, when she was still little, used to play with the necklace. She had a favorite pearl, that specific one that Margaret had kept. The girl said that pearl had a special shine, that it seemed to hold secrets. After the young woman's departure, Margaret couldn't part with that specific pearl. It was like keeping a piece of her daughter with her. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with shared sadness. Everyone there, each in their own way, felt the pain of that mother who had lost her reason for living. But Margaret hadn't finished her story. There was more, much more that she needed to reveal, and what would come next would change everything again. She said she hadn't searched for the necklace just for sentimental reasons or to create a scholarship program. There was a much more personal, much more urgent reason. Before her daughter's departure, Margaret had made a promise. She had sworn that the necklace would be passed to the next generation, to the granddaughter that Margaret never had the chance to properly know. The employees exchanged glances, confused. Eleanor closed her eyes, understanding before the others where that revelation was going. Margaret explained that her daughter had become a mother very young, at 17. The child's father had abandoned them both, and Margaret's daughter raised the girl alone with her grandmother's support. But when the mother passed away, the girl was only 5 years old. Margaret, devastated by the loss and sinking into deep depression, couldn't care for her granddaughter. The child went to live with a distant aunt, the sister of the father who had abandoned her daughter. Margaret had little contact with her granddaughter in the following years. Every time she saw her, she was reminded of the daughter she had lost. It was too painful. So she distanced herself, thinking she was doing what was best for the girl. But recently, after decades living on the streets, Margaret had an epiphany. She wasn't honoring her daughter's memory by drowning in sorrow. She was wasting the chance to get to know her granddaughter, to pass on not just the pearl necklace, but also the family history, the teachings, the love. So she began searching for her granddaughter. She discovered that the young woman, now 28 years old, had moved to New York City. But Margaret had no address, no phone number, nothing but a name, and the last piece of information that her granddaughter worked doing cleaning somewhere in the city. It took months of searching. Margaret visited dozens of cleaning companies, asked questions at shelters, talked to people on the streets. Finally, 3 weeks ago, she had found a lead. Someone mentioned a young woman who worked doing overnight cleaning at a luxury mall. Eleanor widened her eyes. Jessica brought her hand to her mouth. Ryan felt a shiver run down his spine. Margaret continued, saying she had spent the last few weeks sleeping near the Fifth Avenue Mall, waiting, watching, trying to find her granddaughter. She knew the young woman worked at one of the stores but didn't know which one. Until a few days ago, she had seen a young lady who was the exact copy of her daughter at the same age, entering the jewelry store at 2 in the morning with cleaning equipment. That's when Margaret had the idea to use the necklace as an excuse to enter the store during business hours. She couldn't just show up at 2 in the morning and approach her granddaughter while the young woman was working. It would be frightening, inappropriate. But if she came during the day, talked to the managers, maybe she could find out the name of the cleaning staff member, get a phone number, a way to make proper contact. Jessica began to tremble. She knew who did the overnight cleaning at the jewelry store. It was Emily, a quiet and hard-working young woman who rarely spoke with the daytime staff. Emily Johnson. Johnson, the same last name as Margaret. Ryan ran to the office and pulled the records from the cleaning company that provided services for the store. Emily Johnson, 28 years old, had worked there for nearly 3 years. On the night shift, from 2 in the morning to 6 in the morning, Monday through Saturday. Eleanor picked up the phone and called the cleaning company. She explained that she needed to speak with Emily Johnson urgently, that it was a family matter. The operator said Emily wasn't working that morning, that she had taken the day off to handle personal matters. Margaret felt her heart tighten. She was so close, so incredibly close, and now her granddaughter was unreachable. Eleanor, seeing the desperation on the pianist's face, had another idea. She asked Jessica to check the cleaning company's records to see if there was any address or contact phone number for Emily. Jessica found a cell phone number. With trembling hands, she dialed and put it on speakerphone. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. No one answered. They tried again, nothing. Margaret closed her eyes, fighting the wave of disappointment that threatened to swallow her. After so much time, so much searching, being so close and yet so far was almost unbearable. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing, it was William who suggested they wait. Emily would surely come to collect her payment at the end of the month, or perhaps return to work the next day. Margaret could stay there, wait as long as necessary. But the pianist shook her head. She had spent decades avoiding confronting her past, avoiding doing what was right. She couldn't wait any longer. She needed to find Emily today, now, as soon as possible. Eleanor had an idea. She knew the owner of the cleaning company, an older gentleman who provided services for several of her stores. She picked up the phone and called him directly, explaining the situation. The man, moved by the story, provided Emily's home address, although technically he shouldn't have done so. It was an address in the Bronx, on the outskirts of New York City, more than 2 hours away from the Fifth Avenue Mall. Eleanor immediately offered her driver and her car to take Margaret there. The pianist accepted for the first time, allowing someone to help her. But before they left, there was a discussion about the necklace. Margaret insisted that Eleanor should keep it, since it had been legally purchased. The businesswoman insisted that the necklace should return to its original owner. In the end, they reached an agreement. The necklace would be used as part of the scholarship program. It would be on display in the main store as a symbol of the project, but legally it would still belong to Margaret's lineage, passing to Emily when the program no longer needed it for fundraising. Jessica asked to go along. Ryan too. William would stay to look after the store. Eleanor agreed, and the 4 of them left together in the businesswoman's executive car, Margaret still holding the small wooden box with her pearl. The journey was long and quiet. Margaret looked out the window, watching the city change around them as they left the wealthy areas and entered the more humble regions. Eleanor held the pianist's hand, offering silent support. Jessica and Ryan were in the back seat, each processing the extraordinary events of the morning. When they finally arrived at the provided address, they saw that it was an old apartment building for low-income residents with worn walls and external concrete stairs. The driver parked out front and everyone got out of the car. Margaret slowly climbed the stairs, her heart beating so loudly she could hear it in her ears. Emily's apartment was number 304 on the 3rd floor. When they reached the door, Margaret hesitated, her hand hovering in the air before knocking. Eleanor gently touched her shoulder, encouraging her. Margaret knocked on the door 3 times, and then waited. Footsteps approached from the other side. The door opened, revealing a young woman with brown hair tied in a ponytail, tired but kind eyes, wearing simple home clothes. She looked at the group at her door with evident confusion. "Emily?" asked Eleanor. The young woman nodded, still confused, her expression silently asking who these people were and what they wanted. Margaret stepped forward. The 2 women stared at each other, and it was as if time had stopped. Emily, who had grown up seeing only faded photographs of her grandmother, recognized the eyes, the shape of the face, the features that were still visible despite the difficult years on the streets. "Grandma?" The word came out as an incredulous whisper. Margaret nodded, tears streaming freely down her face. Emily covered her mouth with her hands, her own eyes filling with tears. The 2 stood still for endless seconds, and then Emily threw herself into her grandmother's arms, hugging her tightly while sobbing. Jessica was crying too, as was Eleanor. Even the driver, who had remained in the car, was discreetly wiping his eyes. When they finally separated, Emily invited everyone inside. The apartment was tiny, just one room that served as both living room and bedroom, with a kitchenette and a bathroom. But it was clean, organized, with personal touches that made the space welcoming despite its simplicity. Emily offered water, coffee, whatever she had. Eleanor accepted a glass of water, more to make the young woman feel comfortable than out of actual thirst. Margaret couldn't take her eyes off her granddaughter, memorizing every detail, every expression. The young woman, still processing the sudden presence of the grandmother she hadn't seen in over 20 years, had 1,000 questions. But it was Margaret who started speaking first, explaining where she had been, what she had done, why she had left. She apologized repeatedly, admitting that she had been cowardly, that she had prioritized her own pain over her granddaughter's needs. Emily listened to everything in silence, tears continuously streaming down her face. When Margaret finished, the young woman took a deep breath and began her own story. She said she had spent years looking for her grandmother. After moving to New York City at 20, she dedicated every free hour trying to find Margaret. She visited shelters, talked to people on the streets, made posters, social media posts. But she never found anything. 3 years ago, when she got the job as a night cleaner at the jewelry store in the Fifth Avenue Mall, Emily had had a strange feeling. Her mother, before passing away, had told stories about the family pearl necklace, about how it had been sold at a luxury jewelry store. Emily didn't know if it was the same jewelry store, but something pulled her there. She accepted the job, hoping in a distant corner of her mind that maybe one day Margaret would appear looking for the necklace. It was a small hope, almost impossible, but it was all she had. The revelation left everyone stunned. Jessica and Ryan realized that Emily had spent 3 years cleaning their store every night, and they barely knew her name. They had never stopped to talk, to get to know the young woman who worked while they slept. Eleanor was impressed with the young woman's persistence, with her unshakable faith that her grandmother would eventually come. Emily had the same quiet determination as Margaret, the same inner strength that kept a person standing, even when everything seemed lost. Margaret took the small wooden box from her pocket and handed it to her granddaughter. Emily opened it with trembling hands, revealing the black pearl that shone under the light of the small apartment. The young woman gasped when she saw the jewel. "My mother used to show me pictures of the necklace," said Emily. "She always said that one day I would wear it, that it was a family tradition." Margaret explained about the scholarship program, about how the complete necklace would be used to help young artists. Emily not only agreed but offered to help. She said she worked as a cleaner to pay the bills, but her real dream was to study music. She had inherited the talent of her grandmother and mother, but never had the means to develop it properly. Eleanor saw an opportunity. She offered Emily an immediate scholarship to the best conservatory in New York City, the same institution where she herself had studied decades ago thanks to Margaret. The young woman could hardly believe what she was hearing. Jessica made an offer too. She said Emily no longer needed to work as a night cleaner if she didn't want to. The jewelry store could hire her to help with the scholarship program during the day, working directly with Margaret. Ryan, feeling even more ashamed of his earlier behavior, offered to personally pay for Emily's first year of studies at the conservatory, a way to redeem himself for having judged her grandmother so harshly. Emily was overwhelmed with so many offers, so many opportunities arising at once. She looked at her grandmother, seeking guidance. Margaret smiled, a genuine smile that lit up her tired face in a way the people in the store had never seen before. "Accept it, my granddaughter," said the pianist. "Your mother would have wanted you to live your dreams." There were many tears in that small apartment that afternoon, many stories told, many lost years mourned, but also much renewed hope. Margaret shared stories of her daughter's life, sharing memories that Emily had never heard. The young woman hung on every word, eager to know the mother she barely remembered. Eleanor shared her own memories of Margaret as a teacher, painting a portrait of a talented and generous woman who had impacted countless lives. Jessica and Ryan simply listened, learning valuable lessons about judgment, humility, and compassion. When they finally returned to the mall, it was already late afternoon. Emily came with them, carrying a small suitcase with her things. Eleanor had insisted that she stay temporarily in an apartment the company maintained for visiting executives until she could get settled. At the jewelry store, William was waiting anxiously. When he saw Margaret and Emily together, he smiled broadly. There were more people waiting too. The news of what had happened that morning had spread among employees from other stores in the chain, and several had come to meet the legendary pianist. Among them was a woman around 40 years old who approached Margaret timidly. She introduced herself as Rachel Harrison, William's sister. She was the one who had received the anonymous scholarship 20 years earlier. Rachel brought her 15-year-old daughter, who studied violin and dreamed of becoming a professional musician. Margaret spoke at length with the teenager, listening to her talk about her aspirations, her fears, her dreams. She saw so much of herself in that young girl, so much of what she had been before life took tragic turns. The evening was long. Eleanor organized a special dinner at a nearby restaurant, inviting all the jewelry store employees. During the meal, she officially announced the scholarship program, which would be called the Black Pearls Project, in honor of the necklace that had started it all. Emily would be the first recipient, but there would be many others. Eleanor donated a significant initial amount to start the fund, and other store customers, upon hearing the story, began making donations as well. Jessica took on the responsibility of documenting everything, creating a detailed record of Margaret's story, the necklace, the reunion. She proposed that the story be shared on the company's social media, not for self-promotion, but to inspire others to look beyond appearances. Ryan, whose transformation was perhaps the most dramatic of all, proposed a mandatory training program for all employees on empathy and customer respect. He publicly admitted his mistakes, using them as an example of what not to do. In the following weeks, noticeable changes began to happen. The Fifth Avenue Mall jewelry store became known not only for its luxury pieces, but for the exemplary treatment it gave all customers, regardless of appearance or social status. The black pearl necklace was placed in a special display in the center of the store, with the Johnson family story written on a plaque beside it. Margaret's individual pearl was set in a ring and given to Emily, so she would always have a piece of the family heritage with her. Margaret, initially reluctant to leave the streets, eventually agreed to live in the apartment Eleanor offered. It wasn't luxurious, but it was comfortable and safe. More importantly, it was just a few minutes' walk from Emily's apartment, allowing grandmother and granddaughter to make up for lost time. The pianist began teaching again, not at a formal conservatory, but in community spaces provided by the jewelry store chain. She taught underprivileged children, dream-filled teenagers, adults who had never had the opportunity to learn music. Her hands, which she thought were irreparably damaged, rediscovered the magic of the piano keys. Emily dedicated herself to her studies with fierce passion. She discovered she had talent not only for playing, but also for composing. Her musical pieces carried a beautiful melancholy, reflecting the pains and losses her family had faced, but also hope and redemption. William, inspired by all he had witnessed, began researching other rare jewels in the store, investigating their histories. He discovered that many pieces had fascinating narratives behind them, stories of love, loss, tradition, sacrifice. These stories were documented and shared, transforming the jewelry store into something more than just a place of commerce. Rachel Harrison brought her daughter to take lessons with Margaret. The teenager flourished under the guidance of the experienced pianist, her talent developing in ways that surprised even Rachel herself. Jessica discovered a passion for jewelry history and storytelling. She began studying gemology at night, learning not only about the monetary value of stones, but about their origins, their journeys through the centuries. Her work documenting Margaret's story became a presentation she started giving at schools, teaching young people about empathy and human value. Ryan completely changed his approach to work. He stopped seeing clients as numbers on a sales chart and began seeing them as people with stories, needs, and dignity. His sales, ironically, increased significantly. People responded to genuine authenticity and respect. The Black Pearls Project grew beyond initial expectations. Other jewelry stores inspired by the initiative started similar programs. Famous musicians offered benefit performances. Conservatory teachers volunteered to give free lessons. Eleanor, seeing the program's success, decided to expand. She opened a cultural space attached to the main store, with a small but well-equipped concert hall. There, the program's scholarship recipients could present their performances, gain stage experience, connect with the community. The first concert in that hall was by Margaret and Emily, playing together for the first time. Margaret was nervous, her hands trembling as she sat at the piano after decades away. But when the first notes came out, something magical happened. The music flowed from her as if she had never stopped. Emily played violin beside her grandmother, their melodies intertwining in perfect harmony. In the audience, Eleanor wept with emotion. Jessica and Ryan were there, as were William and his family. There were also dozens of people who had been helped by Margaret over the years, many of whom only now discovered who their anonymous benefactor had been. Among the audience was a middle-aged man who approached Margaret after the concert. He introduced himself as Peter Johnson, Emily's father who had abandoned her mother decades earlier. He had come to apologize, to try to make amends, but Margaret gently turned him away. Some wounds were too deep, some abandonments too unforgivable. Emily, however, decided to give her father a chance. She didn't forgive him immediately, but agreed to talk, to hear his side of the story. Margaret respected her granddaughter's decision, though she didn't agree with it. It was Emily's life, her choices to make. In the following months, the relationship between Emily and Peter developed slowly. The man was remorseful, had built a better life for himself, had a family. He wanted Emily to meet her half-siblings, wanted to include her in his life. The young woman moved forward cautiously, protecting her heart, but also remaining open to the possibility of some form of reconciliation. Margaret watched all this with mixed feelings. Part of her wanted to protect her granddaughter from further disappointments, but another part recognized that Emily was an adult, capable of making her own decisions and dealing with the consequences. The scholarship program continued growing. In the first year, it helped 20 young musicians. In the second year, 50. Eleanor expanded it to include other art forms, dance, theatre, visual arts. The jewelry chain became known not just for luxury products, but for its social commitment. Jessica was promoted to Corporate Social Responsibility Manager. Ryan took over managing a new store Eleanor opened, applying the lessons he'd learned. William trained a new generation of appraisers, teaching them not just about gemstones, but about the importance of respecting the story behind each piece. Margaret, for the first time in decades, felt her life had purpose again. She hadn't forgotten her daughter. She would never forget. But she learned that honoring her memory didn't mean drowning in sadness. It meant living, helping others, making a difference. Emily graduated from the conservatory with honors. Her graduation performance was an original composition dedicated to her grandmother and the mother she never properly knew. The musical piece told the story of 3 generations of women, of losses and reunions, of black pearls that shone even in darkness. Eleanor sat in the front row, beside Margaret. The 2 women held hands, united by decades of history and mutual affection. Jessica recorded everything on video, creating another chapter in the documentary she was making about the Black Pearls project. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out now continuing. After graduation, Emily received several job offers. Orchestras wanted to hire her. Conservatories wanted her to teach, music producers wanted to record her compositions. But she chose something different. She decided to continue working full-time with the Black Pearls project, helping the next generation of artists have the opportunities she had. Margaret felt proud of her granddaughter's decision. She saw so much of her lost daughter in Emily, the generosity, the compassion, the inner strength. It was as if somehow her daughter continued living through the young woman she had left behind. The story of Margaret and Emily spread beyond New York City. National newspapers published stories. Television programs invited them for interviews. But they always kept the focus on the project, on the lives being transformed, not on their own fame. One day, a young woman named Lily appeared at the jewelry store. She was 17 years old and carried an old, worn violin. She said she had seen a story about the Black Pearls project and wanted to apply for a scholarship. But there was a problem. She had no way to properly prove her talent, as she'd never had formal lessons, having only taught herself through online videos. Emily offered to listen to her play. Lily, nervous, took her violin and began a piece by Bach. The first notes were shaky, uncertain, but then something changed. The girl lost herself in the music, forgot where she was, who was listening. She played with soul, with passion, with a raw talent that made everyone stop to listen. When she finished, there were tears in Margaret's eyes. She saw so much of herself in that young woman, the passion for music, the talent that only needed opportunity to blossom. Lily was accepted into the program immediately. She wasn't the only one. Over the years, hundreds of young people passed through the Black Pearls Project. Some became professional musicians. Others discovered music was a hobby, not a career, and found other paths. But everyone was impacted. Everyone carried with them the lessons about human value, about looking beyond appearances, about kindness and opportunity. Ryan, in his new store, implemented an unprecedented policy. Once a month, the store was opened for a community afternoon, where people from all social classes were invited to simply come in, look around, dream. There was no pressure to buy, no judgment. It was just an opportunity to expose people who would normally be excluded from luxury spaces to the beauty of high-end jewelry. These afternoons became immensely popular. Families came, children stared wide-eyed at the diamonds and emeralds, and on some special occasions, Emily and other musicians from the project played during these afternoons, creating an experience that united art and luxury in unexpected ways. Jessica, in her work documenting everything, began to notice patterns. Many of the people who participated in the community afternoons returned years later as paying customers. Not because they had suddenly become rich, but because they saved, planned, wanted to buy a special piece from that store that had treated them with respect when no one else did. The traditional business model said this shouldn't work, but it did. Eleanor's jewelry chain grew faster than her competitors, not despite her social policies, but because of them. People wanted to buy from companies that had values, that made a difference. William, now 70 years old, decided to retire. But before leaving, he made one last extraordinary discovery. In his personal archives, he found old correspondence between the former owner of the jewelry store and Margaret's mother, Catherine. The letters revealed that Catherine hadn't sold the necklace out of financial need, as everyone had assumed. She had sold it to pay for someone's medical treatment, and that someone was Eleanor herself, who had fallen seriously ill at 20, right after finishing conservatory. Eleanor was shocked to discover this. She never knew where the money for her treatment had come from. Her parents had said it was a loan from a distant relative, but it was Catherine, Margaret's mother, who had sold her family heirloom to save the life of the young woman her daughter had taught music. The revelation connected the stories in a way no one had imagined. The necklace had been sacrificed to save Eleanor. Eleanor built a successful company. That company now funded a project that helped young artists, and it had all started with Catherine's sacrifice, continued by Margaret, and now perpetuated by Emily. It was a perfect cycle of generosity and gratitude, of giving and receiving, of sacrifice and reward. When Margaret learned the full truth, she cried tears that were half sadness, half joy. Sadness for everything her mother had sacrificed, joy because she now understood that sacrifice had not been in vain. It had created ripples of impact that continued spreading decades later. Eleanor organized a special ceremony to honor Catherine. A plaque was placed in the main store telling the full story. The Black Pearls Project was officially renamed the Catherine Margaret Emily Project, representing the 3 generations of women who had made it possible. Emily composed a symphony in honor of the grandmother she never met. It was performed in a large theater, with free tickets for community members. The hall was packed with people of all ages and social classes sitting side by side. Margaret, sitting in the front row next to Eleanor, listened to her granddaughter's music tell the story of her mother. Every note seemed to capture a moment, an emotion, a truth. When the symphony ended, the applause was deafening. In that moment, Margaret had a revelation. Her daughter had left too young, tragically early. But through Emily, through music, through the project, she continued to live. Her legacy was not only in the young woman she had left behind, but in all the lives that were being touched, all the opportunities that were being created. The pain of loss would never completely disappear. Margaret knew this. She had learned to live with it. But now there was also purpose, there was meaning, there was the feeling that something good had arisen from the tragedy. Peter, Emily's absent father, tried to get closer in the following years, but Emily maintained a healthy distance. She forgave him to some extent, but did not allow him to play a central role in her life. Some damages were irreparable, some absences left permanent marks. Margaret fully supported her granddaughter's decision. She had learned that forgiveness did not mean forgetting, that compassion was not the same as tolerating harmful behavior. They were hard lessons, but necessary ones. Lily, the young woman who had played the violin in the jewelry store for the first time years ago, became one of the most promising violinists of her generation. She auditioned for international orchestras and was accepted into several. But she chose to stay in the United States, specifically in New York City, to remain involved with the Catherine Margaret Emily project. She wanted to give back. She wanted to be for other young people what Emily and Margaret had been for her. It was this cycle of generosity that kept the project alive and growing. Jessica eventually left her job at the jewelry store to become a full-time documentary filmmaker. Her film about Margaret, Emily, and the project was accepted into several film festivals and won awards for its sensitive and inspiring approach. The documentary brought even more attention to the project. Donations increased dramatically. Celebrities began to support the cause. But Eleanor, Margaret, and Emily were careful not to let the project lose its essence. It wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about transforming lives, one at a time. Ryan, who had started that fateful day laughing at a woman in worn-out clothes, became one of the project's greatest advocates. He traveled to other cities helping to replicate the model, teaching other jewelry store managers about empathy and social responsibility. His personal transformation was so profound that he wrote a book about the experience titled The Woman and the Pearl: Lessons in Humility and Human Value. The book became required reading in various management and customer service courses. William, in his retirement, couldn't stay completely away. He volunteered to give lectures on rare jewels, telling the stories behind the precious stones. His presentations were fascinating, blending history, gemology, and human narratives. His sister Rachel opened her own music school for underprivileged children. She used the principles of the Catherine Margaret Emily project, offering quality music education regardless of the student's ability to pay. Her daughter, who had studied with Margaret, became a teacher as well, continuing the teaching legacy that had been so important in her own life. 5 years had passed since that day in the jewelry store. Margaret, now 70 years old, had regained weight and health, and she was no longer on the streets. She had a stable home, she had purpose and family. Emily, at 33, was an established musician and leader of the project that bore her family's name. The two women were closer than ever. They had dinner together several times a week, shared stories, made music. Emily had married a history teacher she met at one of the project's performances. He was kind, respectful, and loved Emily, not in spite of her complicated history, but including it. Margaret saw in them what she had hoped for her own daughter, a healthy relationship based on mutual respect and genuine love. And then came the news that changed everything again. Emily was pregnant. She told Margaret during a quiet dinner, just the two of them. The pianist was speechless for long moments, processing what this meant. It meant the pearl necklace could finally be passed to the next generation, as had been tradition. It meant the lineage would continue, that the story wouldn't end. It meant hope, future, renewal. Margaret hugged her granddaughter and cried, but this time they were tears of pure joy. After so much suffering, so much loss, so much pain, there was finally a new beginning. Emily's pregnancy was closely monitored. Margaret was present at every appointment, every ultrasound. When they found out it was a girl, the decision about the name was unanimous. She would be called Catherine, in honor of the great-grandmother who had sacrificed so much. Eleanor organized a special baby shower at the jewelry store. It was a beautiful event, with live music from the project, delicious food, and the presence of everyone who had been touched by the Johnson family's story. The black pearl necklace was brought from the exhibition, cleaned and polished, ready to eventually be passed to little Catherine when she grew up. Margaret held the necklace in her hands, remembering her mother wearing it, remembering when she herself was young and thought she would wear it one day, remembering how she had kept just one pearl after everything was sold. And now, decades later, the necklace was back. The family was reunited, and there was a new generation to carry the story forward. When Catherine was born, Margaret held the baby in her arms and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: complete peace. The little one had the same eyes as Margaret's mother, the same calm expression. It was as if generations were connecting through that tiny child. Emily and her husband asked Margaret to be the godmother. The pianist accepted with honor and gratitude. She knew she was being given a second chance, an opportunity to be present in a way she hadn't been able to be for Emily when her granddaughter needed her most. The baptism was simple but emotional. Eleanor was chosen as the second godmother, recognizing her essential role in the family's history. Jessica documented everything, of course. Ryan brought a special gift, a small silver bracelet with a single pearl, a miniature replica of the family necklace. William, already quite elderly, was there too, along with Rachel and her family. Lily played violin during the ceremony. It was a gathering of everyone whose lives had been intertwined by that incredible story. In the following months, Margaret spent countless hours with her great-granddaughter. She sang old songs that her own mother had sung to her. She played soft piano, watching the baby react to the music. And she told stories, even knowing Catherine was too young to understand. She told about the baby's great-grandmother, about the sacrifice, about love and family. Emily watched everything with tenderness. She saw her grandmother healing through the child, saw old wounds being soothed by this new love. And she promised herself that Catherine would grow up knowing the whole family story, understanding where she came from, appreciating the sacrifices that were made. The Catherine Margaret Emily project continued growing. With the baby's birth, Eleanor announced a special donation, establishing a permanent fund that would guarantee the project's continuity for generations. Other companies began following the example, creating their own social programs. The purpose-driven business model that Eleanor had pioneered was becoming more common, more accepted, more valued. Margaret, in her moments of reflection, thought about how everything had begun. A bad day when she gathered the courage to enter a jewelry store, carrying a pearl and a photograph. She could have been thrown out, could have given up. But she persisted, and that persistence created a cascade of events that transformed not only her life, but the lives of countless others. She thought of her mother, Catherine, who had sold the necklace to save Eleanor. If she had known what that act of generosity would eventually create, she would have been proud. Her sacrifice had not been in vain. It had borne fruit that would continue to grow for generations. Emily one day asked her grandmother if she still regretted the years she spent on the streets, the years she was away from her. Margaret thought long before answering. She said yes, she deeply regretted not being stronger, not being there for her granddaughter when she was younger. But she also recognized that those years of suffering, of being invisible to society, of experiencing rejection and judgment, had taught her valuable lessons. They had given her deep empathy for those on the margins of society. They had shown her the importance of looking beyond appearances. They had given her stories to share, lessons to teach, wisdom to pass on. So perhaps in a strange and painful way, those years were also part of the journey that brought her to that moment. Emily accepted the answer, understanding that life was complex, that there were no simple answers, that pain and growth often walked together. Eleanor, now 70 years old, began to think about her own succession. She wanted the company to continue with the same values, the same principles. She considered several options and eventually offered a partnership to Emily. The young musician was surprised. She had no business experience, knew nothing about managing jewelry stores, but Eleanor explained that she didn't need to know. She could learn. What mattered was that she understood the essence of what they did, valued people over profits, saw the company as a tool for social change. Emily accepted, on the condition that she could keep her work with music as well. Eleanor agreed. Together they created a model where Emily oversaw the social side of the company, while experienced professionals handled day-to-day operations. It was a perfect arrangement. The company would remain profitable and well-managed, but would never lose its soul, never forget why it was transformed that morning years ago. Jessica released her second documentary, this one focusing specifically on the young people who had been helped by the project. She followed half a dozen of them for a year, documenting their journeys, their struggles, their triumphs. The film was even better received than the first. It showed, in a visceral and real way, the impact that opportunity could have. It showed young people who could have been lost, talents that might never have been discovered, dreams that might have remained just dreams. One of the young women in the documentary was a 15-year-old girl who played the cello. She came from an extremely poor family, had grown up seeing violence and need. But when she played her instrument, all that disappeared. She transcended her circumstances. The project had given her a quality cello, lessons with excellent teachers, performance opportunities, and now she was being considered for one of the best music schools in Europe. Stories like this were common in the project. Not all, of course. Not every young person became a star, but all had their lives changed. All carried with them the lessons about value, about hard work, about compassion. Ryan, in his lectures, always emphasized that the project was not just charity. It was an investment. It was investing in the next generation of artists, thinkers, leaders. And this investment would return multiplied in ways that weren't always financially measurable. William, shortly before passing away at 75, made one final contribution to the project. He donated his personal collection of documents on rare jewels, decades of research and knowledge. He requested they be used to create an archive of stories, a resource for future researchers. His funeral was held in the project's concert hall. Emily played a special piece in his honor. Rachel spoke about how her brother had been transformed by witnessing Margaret's story, how he had spent the last years of his life dedicated to revealing and honoring the stories behind material objects. Margaret, now 75 herself, felt the weight of age. Her hands were no longer as agile on the piano, her voice no longer as strong, but her mind remained sharp, and her heart continued full of love and purpose. Catherine, now 5 years old, showed signs of early musical talent. Margaret began teaching her piano, the same lessons she had taught so many others. But with her great-granddaughter it was different, more personal, more profound. It was like closing a circle, passing on not just a material inheritance like the pearl necklace, but an intangible legacy of music, wisdom, values. Emily, watching grandmother and daughter together at the piano, felt a deep gratitude. Everything could have been so different. If Margaret hadn't found the courage to enter that jewelry store, if Eleanor hadn't recognized her former teacher, if people hadn't been willing to change, to learn, to grow. But everything had happened exactly as it should. And now there was a new generation, a new chance, a new story beginning. One day, Eleanor received an unexpected call. It was from the Department of Culture. The Catherine Margaret Emily Project had been selected to receive a national recognition for its social and cultural impact. The award ceremony was in Washington, D.C. Margaret, Emily, and Eleanor went together, wearing for the occasion the complete black pearls necklace, with each of them wearing a part. Margaret the central necklace, Emily a bracelet made with some of the pearls, Eleanor earrings that had been created with others. It was symbolic. 3 generations, 3 women, united not just by jewelry but by history, purpose, and love. During the ceremony, Emily gave a speech that was broadcast nationally. She told the full story, from the day Margaret entered the jewelry store until that moment. She hid nothing, the poverty, the judgment, the loss, the pain, but she also highlighted the transformation, the hope, the redemption. Her speech touched millions of people. In the following weeks, the project received more donations than it had in years. But more importantly, it received thousands of messages from people sharing their own stories of judgment, of being underestimated, of finding their way despite obstacles. Jessica documented everything, of course. She was working on a book now, expanding the documentaries into a complete narrative. She wanted the story preserved for future generations to serve as a reminder that change was possible, that people could grow, that hope should never be abandoned. Ryan used the renewed attention on the project to launch a national initiative. He challenged other jewelry stores, other luxury businesses, to follow the example. Not all accepted, but many did. Slowly, the industry began to change, to see value not just in profits but in social impact. Margaret, in an interview she gave for Jessica's book, reflected on how a single moment of courage had changed everything. She admitted she almost didn't enter the jewelry store that day, that she almost let fear win, but something pushed her forward. Maybe it was the memory of her daughter, maybe it was the need to make peace with the past, maybe it was simply fate. Whatever the reason, she went in, and everything changed. End of story. And you, what did you think of this story of transformation and reunion? Comment where you're watching from, and if you've ever been in a situation where you judged someone by their appearance. Do you believe Margaret made the right decisions? Leave your opinion in the comments with sincere words. Don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other moving stories. Your participation is very important.